It was one small step for man, but an enormous leap through decades of Cold War tension, disasters, and sleepless nights at NASA. Behind that iconic lunar footprint lies a tale of silent calculations, heart-pounding launches, and the eerie stillness of space that only a handful of humans have ever truly known. Tonight, we drift back through the dust of history and explore the moon landing. From Earth to Tranquility Base. If the idea of floating through the silence of space sounds oddly calming, subscribe and tap the bell icon. Dust will keep bringing you the quietest turning points in human history, perfect for a restful mind. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you? It always amazes me how far these sleepy tales travel. You might imagine that landing humans on the moon began with rockets and spacesuits, with dramatic countdowns and soaring trajectories through the cosmos. But the truth, as it often is in government projects of enormous scope, was far more mundane. The Apollo program began not with fire and thunder, but with meetings. Endless bureaucratic meetings in windowless conference rooms across Washington, D.C., where men in gray suits debated budget allocations and organizational charts with the same methodical precision that would later guide spacecraft across the void between worlds. In the spring of 1961, as President Kennedy prepared to make his famous declaration about reaching the moon before the decade's end, the real work was already underway in the administrative corridors of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration had been established. Just 3 years earlier, and its organizational structure was still fluid, still finding its bureaucratic footing in the complex ecosystem of federal agencies. The challenge wasn't simply technical, though. That would prove daunting enough, but administrative. How do you coordinate the work of hundreds of thousands of people across dozens of states, multiple time zones, and countless contractor facilities? The answer, it turned out, lay in the most boring of administrative tools: organizational charts, reporting structures, and endless documentation requirements. In late 1961, a bureaucratic entity that sounds utterly unremarkable but would become the administrative heart of humanity's greatest adventure. The ASPO, as it was known in the acronym-heavy language of government work, was tasked with coordinating between NASA's field centers, private contractors, and the labyrinthine procurement processes that governed federal spending. Joseph F. Shee, a soft-spoken engineer with a talent for organization, was appointed to lead this office. She understood something that many of his contemporaries didn't: that landing on the moon was fundamentally a management problem. Yes, they would need to solve unprecedented technical challenges, but those solutions would emerge from properly coordinated teamwork, clear communication channels, and methodical documentation of every decision, every test result, every minor modification to every component. Consider the staggering scope of what needed to be managed. The Apollo spacecraft consisted of, and eventually, a lunar module that would be built by an entirely different contractor in a different state. The command module alone contained thousands of individual components, each requiring quality control, documentation, installation procedures, and integration testing protocols. The daily administrative reality was far removed from the popular imagination of space exploration. Shee's office generated hundreds of pages of reports each week, tracking everything from each component had a part number, each part number had documentation requirements, and each document had approval procedures that wound through multiple layers of bureaucracy. The contractor selection process itself revealed the methodical, almost tedious nature of the program's early years. When NASA announced the competition for the Apollo spacecraft contract in 1961, 11 major aerospace companies submitted proposals. Each proposal ran to thousands of pages, detailing not just technical approaches but management philosophies, quality control procedures, and cost accounting methods. Wasn't necessarily the most innovative technically, but it demonstrated the most comprehensive understanding of the administrative complexity involved. The selection process took months. Teams of NASA evaluators worked through each proposal page by page, scoring technical merit, management capability, and cost-effectiveness. The final decision came down not to dramatic presentations or charismatic pitches but to detailed scoring matrices and careful analysis of contractual terms. It was, in every sense, a bureaucratic process, methodical, documented, and utterly lacking in cinematic drama. Once North American Aviation was selected, the real administrative work began. The contract itself was a document of staggering complexity, running to hundreds of pages and covering everything from NASA established resident management offices at North American's facilities in Downey, California, where government employees worked alongside contractor personnel to ensure compliance with specifications and delivery schedules. The daily routine in these offices was mind-numbingly detailed. Progress reports were filed weekly, sometimes daily. Every design change, no matter how minor, required formal documentation and approval through a change control board. When North American's engineers wanted to modify the placement of a switch in the command module, they couldn't simply move it and test the results. Instead, they had to document the proposed change, analyze its implications for other systems, update technical drawings, revise installation procedures, and obtain formal approval from NASA's technical representatives. This bureaucratic methodology extended to every aspect of the program. The development of spacesuits involved similar administrative complexity, with detailed specifications for everything from the threading on helmet connections to the flame resistance properties of fabric. Materials? NASA's quality assurance requirements mandated that every step of the manufacturing process be documented, with detailed records kept of every component's fabrication, testing, and installation. The Kennedy Space Center construction project, meanwhile, was proceeding through its own maze of administrative requirements. The moonport, as it was sometimes called, required congressional appropriations that had to be justified through detailed cost-benefit analyses and construction schedules, covering everything from the dimensions of the concrete launch pad 430 feet in diameter and 8 inches thick to the placement of safety equipment and communication systems. The daily work of building Apollo was, in truth, largely paperwork. Engineers spent as much time documenting their decisions as implementing them. Test results were recorded in triplicate, with copies filed in multiple offices and backup systems. When a component failed during testing, the failure had to be documented. Not just technically, but administratively, who was responsible, what approvals were needed for redesign, how the schedule would be affected, and what additional costs would be incurred. But perhaps the most telling aspect of Apollo's early administrative phase was the attention paid to seemingly trivial details. NASA established detailed procedures for everything from the storage of technical drawings to the approval process for press releases. They created organizational charts that specified not just who reported to whom, but exactly what types of decisions could be made at each level of authority. They wrote procedures for writing procedures, creating a meta-bureaucracy that governed the creation of the bureaucracy itself. What emerges from this administrative foundation is a picture of the Apollo program as fundamentally an exercise in large-scale project management. The technical achievements, the rockets, the spacecraft, navigation systems, were the visible outputs of an invisible administrative machine that coordinated the work of across the United States. Every one of those people had a job description, a reporting structure, and a set of administrative procedures that governed their daily work by 1967. As the first Apollo mission approached, this administrative foundation was largely complete. The organizational charts were finalized, the procedures documented, the contractor relationships established. What had begun as a presidential declaration had become a functioning bureaucratic entity of enormous complexity and capability. But there remained one final test of this administrative system, one that would reveal both its strengths and its fundamental vulnerabilities. The question that hung over the program as the first crewed mission approached was not whether the technology would work. That could be tested and verified, but whether the administrative systems could handle the inevitable crisis when something went catastrophically wrong by 1965. The administrative foundation of Apollo had evolved into something resembling a small city-state, complete with its own economy, social hierarchy, and daily rhythms. The program now employed, scattered across contractor facilities from California to New York, all coordinated through an increasingly sophisticated bureaucratic apparatus that NERTSUS operated with the precision of a Swiss watch and the complexity of a federal tax code. The heart of this administrative ecosystem was the relationship between NASA and its primary contractors. A relationship governed by contracts so detailed they specified not just what would be built, but how it would be managed, documented, and delivered. Where the command and service modules were being built had become a quasi-governmental facility where NASA employees worked alongside contractor personnel in an arrangement that blurred the traditional boundaries between public and private enterprise. The daily routine at Downey was governed by administrative procedures that would have seemed familiar to any federal bureaucrat. Each morning began with status meetings where progress was measured not in dramatic breakthroughs or inspiring achievements, but in the completion of specific line items on detailed schedules. Engineers reported on the percentage completion of technical drawings, the delivery status of components from subcontractors, and the resolution of quality control issues that had been identified in previous inspections. Harrison Storms, who managed Apollo spacecraft development for North American Aviation, presided over an organization that had grown to resemble a government agency more than a traditional aerospace company. His daily schedule was filled with administrative meetings rather than technical discussions. He reviewed budget reports, approved personnel changes, and participated in coordination calls with NASA administrators and other contractors. The creative, entrepreneurial culture that had characterized earlier aerospace projects had been replaced by something more methodical and bureaucratic, but also more reliable and predictable. The administrative burden was enormous. Every component of the Apollo spacecraft required what NASA called a paper trail documentation that tracked each part from initial specification through manufacturing, testing, installation, and final acceptance. A single heat shield tile, for example, might generate dozens of documents, material specifications, supplier certifications, manufacturing work orders, quality control inspection reports, test results, installation procedures, and final acceptance. Documentation. Multiply this by the thousands of components in each spacecraft, and the paperwork became a significant logistical challenge in its own right. NASA had established resident management offices at each major contractor facility, staffed with civil servants whose job was to monitor contractor performance and ensure compliance with government requirements. These officials, often engineers themselves, spent their days reviewing technical documentation, observing manufacturing processes, and participating in design reviews. Their work was less about innovation than verification, ensuring that contractors were following approved procedures and meeting specified requirements. The relationship between NASA and its contractors was governed by what the agency called configuration control, formal procedures for managing changes to approved designs. When a contractor wanted to modify any aspect of the spacecraft design, even something as simple as the placement of a switch or the routing of a cable, they had to submit a formal change request. This request would be reviewed by NASA technical specialists subjected to impact analysis to determine how the change might affect other systems, and eventually approved or rejected through a formal change control board process. The administrative complexity was multiplied by the involvement of multiple prime contractors. While North American Aviation was building the command and service modules in California, was developing the lunar module at their facility in Bethpage, New York. These two spacecraft would need to work together seamlessly, but they were being built by different companies using different procedures and different interpretations of NASA's requirements. Coordinating between these geographically separated teams required yet another layer of administrative procedure. NASA established interface control documents that specified exactly how the two spacecraft would connect and interact. These documents had to be updated whenever either contractor made a design change, requiring coordination calls, technical reviews, and formal approvals from multiple organizations. The administrative overhead of maintaining consistency between the two projects was enormous, but absolutely essential for mission success. Meanwhile, at Kennedy Space Center in Florida, was developing to handle the operational aspects of Apollo missions. The Launch Operations Center, as it was initially called, was building not just launch facilities, but the procedural framework for conducting launches. This included everything from countdown procedures to abort protocols to post-flight data. Recovery systems. The construction of Launch Complex 34 itself illustrated the administrative complexity of the program. The facility required coordination between dozens of contractors and subcontractors, each with their own schedules, procedures, and quality requirements. The concrete for the launch pad had to meet NASA specifications that were more stringent than those used for most construction projects. The electrical systems had to be installed according to procedures that ensured they could withstand the electromagnetic interference generated by rocket launches. The communication systems had to integrate with similar systems at other NASA facilities and with the spacecraft itself. Every aspect of these construction projects was documented with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized spacecraft development. Construction drawings were reviewed and approved through formal processes. Material specifications were verified through testing and certification procedures. Installation work was inspected and documented according to quality control protocols that ensured every component met NASA requirements. The administrative burden extended even to seemingly routine activities. When NASA needed to transport spacecraft components between facilities, this required detailed planning and documentation. The command modules were too large to ship by conventional means, so NASA had to develop special transportation procedures using cargo aircraft or ships. Each shipment required formal documentation specifying how components should be packaged, handled, and verified upon arrival at their destination. The scale of this administrative dispatch apparatus was unprecedented in peacetime government operations. NASA was processing thousands of documents each week, coordinating the activities of hundreds of organizations, and managing budgets that rivaled those of entire federal departments. The agency had developed its own administrative culture, with procedures and protocols that governed every aspect of program operations. By 1966, this administrative machine was functioning smoothly, processing the enormous volume of decisions, documentation, and coordination required to build spacecraft and launch facilities. Status reports flowed upward through organizational hierarchies, while technical requirements and schedule changes flowed downward to operational levels. The system was bureaucratic in the truest sense, methodical, documented, and designed to function regardless of the personalities or preferences of individual participants. Yet this administrative success contained the seeds of potential failure. The very comprehensiveness of NASA's procedures, the very thoroughness of their documentation requirements, may have created a false sense of security. When administrators could point to thousands of pages of technical specifications, detailed test results, and formal approval processes, it became easy to assume that all risks had been identified and mitigated. The administrative apparatus was so comprehensive that it seemed almost impossible for anything to go seriously wrong. But bureaucratic systems, no matter how sophisticated, are only as reliable as the human judgment that guides them. And as Apollo approached its first crewed mission in early 1967, that human judgment would face its ultimate test. The final months before. Apollo's first crewed mission revealed the curious way that bureaucratic systems can simultaneously prevent and enable catastrophic failures. Every day brought hundreds of small decisions, each processed through NASA's elaborate administrative machinery, each documented and approved according to established procedures. Individually, these decisions seemed routine, even trivial. Collectively, they were steering the program toward either triumph or tragedy, though no single person could see the full pattern as it emerged. In late 1966, as Apollo 1 preparations intensified, the daily rhythm at Kennedy Space Center had settled into a predictable pattern of meetings, reviews, and procedural compliance. The spacecraft, designated Apollo 204 in the internal numbering system, but known to the public as Apollo 1, was undergoing what NASA called systems integration, the methodical process of connecting all components and verifying that they worked together as intended. This integration process was governed by procedures that had been refined over months of planning. Each connection had to be documented, tested, and approved. Every system had to be verified individually before being integrated with other systems. The process was designed to be foolproof, with multiple layers of review and verification to catch any potential problems before they could affect the mission. Yet within this seemingly comprehensive system, small compromises were being made daily. The command module's environmental control system, for example, was designed to operate with a pure oxygen atmosphere at low pressure. This decision had been made years earlier, based on technical analysis and approved through NASA's formal review processes. It simplified the design and reduced weight to crucial considerations for spacecraft development. However, the administrative system that had approved this decision was less effective at tracking its implications as other design decisions accumulated around it. When materials engineers selected cabin furnishings, they followed procedures that ensured compliance with flammability standards. But these standards had been developed for normal atmospheric conditions, not the pure oxygen environment that would exist inside the spacecraft. The administrative system that reviewed material selection was separate from the system that had approved the atmospheric design, and there was no formal process for ensuring that decisions made by one group were fully considered by the others. This pattern repeated across dozens of other design decisions. The spacecraft's wiring was installed according to procedures that met electrical safety standards. But these procedures didn't fully account for the way that damaged wiring might behave in a pure oxygen atmosphere. The hatch design was approved based on structural requirements and operational procedures. But the approval process didn't include a comprehensive analysis of how quickly the hatch could be opened in an emergency, particularly when the spacecraft's internal pressure was higher than the external pressure. The administrative machinery continued to function exactly as designed, processing each decision through appropriate review channels and maintaining meticulous documentation of all approvals. Yet the system's very success at managing individual decisions may have obscured the way these decisions interacted with each other to create new, unforeseen risks. Meanwhile, the astronaut crew Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee was proceeding through their own administrative routine of training schedules, medical examinations, and procedural reviews. Their training was governed by detailed syllabi that specified exactly which skills they needed to master and how their proficiency would be verified. They practiced emergency procedures repeatedly. But these procedures had been developed based on the types of emergencies that administrators and engineers had anticipated. It's not necessarily the emergencies that might actually occur. The crew expressed concerns about various aspects of the spacecraft, but these concerns were processed through the same administrative channels that handled all feedback. Their complaints about communication problems were logged, investigated, and addressed according to standard procedures. Their observations about the spacecraft's complexity were documented and forwarded to appropriate technical teams for review. The administrative system was responsive to their concerns, but it was also designed to filter and prioritize. Feedback according to established criteria might not capture the full significance of what the crew was experiencing. Joseph Shee, still managing the Apollo spacecraft program office, was receiving hundreds of status reports each week. His staff had developed sophisticated systems for tracking the completion of various tasks and identifying potential schedule conflicts. They could tell him precisely which components had been installed, which tests had been completed, and which milestones were on schedule. But this information, while accurate, was necessarily abstracted from the physical reality of the spacecraft itself. The administrative apparatus had become so comprehensive that it was generating its own momentum. Schedules established months earlier were driving daily decisions, even when circumstances suggested that those schedules might need to be revised. Budget allocations approved through the federal appropriations process were determining resource allocation, even when technical realities suggested that different priorities might be more appropriate. The system was designed to prevent arbitrary changes and ensure systematic progress, but it was also resistant to the kind of fundamental reassessment that might have revealed emerging risks. Launch Complex 34 itself had become a monument to administrative thoroughness. Every system had been installed according to approved procedures, tested according to established protocols, and documented according to NASA standards. The facility represented the successful completion of thousands of individual administrative tasks, each performed by qualified personnel following approved procedures. Yet this very success may have created overconfidence in the system's ability to handle any situation that might arise. As January 27, 1967 approached, the date scheduled for a routine test that would place the crew inside the sealed spacecraft. While connected to ground power, the administrative machinery was functioning exactly as designed. Status reports indicated that all systems were ready. Quality control inspections had been completed and documented. The crew had completed their training requirements. All necessary approvals had been obtained, and all procedures had been reviewed and approved. The test itself was considered routine. So routine that it wasn't even classified as hazardous. The spacecraft would remain on the ground, connected to external power, while the crew practiced various procedures and verified that all systems were working properly. The administrative analysis had concluded that since the spacecraft wouldn't leave the ground and wouldn't be fueled, the test posed minimal risk to the crew. This administrative conclusion was based on a thorough analysis of known risks, but it couldn't account for the way that multiple individual decisions, each reasonable in isolation, might combine to create unprecedented hazards. The pure oxygen atmosphere, the material selection, the wiring installation, hatch design, each had been approved through appropriate administrative channels. But no single administrative process had analyzed how these decisions might interact under the specific conditions of the January 27th test, as the crew prepared to enter the spacecraft that January afternoon. They were protected by the most comprehensive administrative safety system that had ever been developed for a space program. Every procedure had been reviewed. Every component had been tested. Every contingency that administrators and engineers could imagine had been analyzed and addressed. The administrative apparatus was functioning perfectly, processing information and coordinating activities with the methodical precision that had characterized the entire Apollo program. Yet within this administrative perfection lay the seeds of catastrophe, hidden in the spaces between established procedures, in the interactions between separate administrative systems, in the gap between what bureaucratic processes could anticipate and what reality might deliver. In just a few hours, this administrative machinery would face its ultimate test, not just of its ability to manage routine operations, but of its capacity to respond when the unthinkable occurred. The fire that killed Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee on the evening of January 27, 1967, lasted less than 30 seconds. But the administrative response to that fire would consume the better part of a year, generating thousands of pages of documentation, dozens of formal investigations, and a complete reorganization of NASA's management structure. In the peculiar way that bureaucratic systems respond to crisis, the Apollo program's reaction to tragedy was both methodical and transformative, revealing how institutional learning occurs through the accumulation of procedures, reports, and reorganizations within hours of the fire. This immediate response wasn't driven by grief or shock, but by established NASA procedures for handling accidents. The agency had protocols for accident investigation that specified exactly what needed to be secured, who needed to be notified, and how the investigation would be organized. The administrative machinery clicked into action with the same methodical precision that had characterized the Apollo program's development. Naming Floyd L. Thompson, director of NASA's Langley Research Center, as chairman. The board's composition reflected NASA's institutional approach to problem solving. Senior technical managers, experienced engineers, and one astronaut, Frank Borman, to represent the operational perspective. What followed was perhaps the most thorough administrative investigation in the history of space exploration. The review board established 21 specialized panels to examine different aspects of the accident. From materials analysis to procedures review to organizational assessment. Each panel was staffed with subject matter experts and given specific investigative responsibilities. The administrative structure was designed to ensure that every aspect of the accident would be examined systematically. With clear lines of authority and responsibility, the board met daily, following formal procedures that governed how evidence would be reviewed, witnesses interviewed, and findings documented. These weren't informal discussions or brainstorming sessions, but structured administrative proceedings with formal agendas, recorded minutes, and documented decisions. The physical investigation itself became an exercise in administrative thoroughness that bordered on the obsessive. This wasn't done for dramatic effect or symbolic reasons, but for entirely practical administrative purposes. Investigators needed to practice their disassembly procedures on an undamaged spacecraft before attempting the more delicate process on the fire-damaged vehicle. The methodical nature of this investigation was remarkable. When they finally began disassembling the fire-damaged Command Module 012 in February, every step was documented with the same attention to detail that had characterized the spacecraft's original construction. About 1,000 of them from the Command Module itself. Each item was photographed, described, and analyzed for evidence of fire damage. The process was painstakingly slow, but it was also comprehensive in a way that only bureaucratic thoroughness can achieve. Meanwhile, the administrative machinery was processing the investigation's findings in real time. As each panel completed its analysis, preliminary reports were circulated through NASA's management hierarchy for review and comment. These reports weren't just technical documents, but administrative assessments that evaluated not only what had gone wrong, but how NASA's procedures and organizational structure had contributed to the accident. The investigation revealed something that many observers found deeply troubling. The accident wasn't the result of a single catastrophic failure or oversight, but rather the accumulation of small administrative and technical decisions that had individually seemed reasonable, but collectively created unprecedented risks. The pure oxygen atmosphere, the flammable materials, the complex wiring installation, the difficult-to-open hatch edge. Decision had been made according to established procedures and approved through appropriate channels. This revelation posed a fundamental challenge to NASA's administrative philosophy. The agency had built its reputation on systematic procedures and methodical analysis. The Apollo program itself was a monument to bureaucratic thoroughness, with every decision documented and every procedure verified. Yet this very systematization may have contributed to the accident by making it difficult to see how individual decisions interacted to create new risks. The review board's investigation became, in effect, an investigation of NASA's administrative system itself. Board members interviewed not just technical personnel and witnesses to the accident, but managers and administrators throughout the NASA hierarchy. They examined organizational charts, reviewed decision-making processes, and analyzed communication patterns between different parts of the agency. What emerged from this administrative autopsy was a picture of an organization that had become so focused on following established procedures that it had lost some of its ability to question those procedures. The very comprehensiveness of NASA's administrative system been detailed specifications, formal review processes, and documented approval procedures had created a kind of bureaucratic momentum that made fundamental reassessment difficult. Congressional involvement added another layer of administrative complexity to the investigation. These hearings weren't just oversight activities, but administrative proceedings in their own right, with formal procedures for witness testimony, document submission, and public disclosure of findings. The administrative burden of responding to congressional oversight was enormous. NASA had to prepare detailed briefings, submit thousands of pages of documentation, and coordinate testimony from dozens of officials. The agency's normal operations were significantly disrupted by the need to respond to congressional inquiries. But this disruption was itself part of the administrative process through which democratic institutions respond to institutional failures. A document that stands as perhaps the most comprehensive administrative analysis of a single accident in government history. The report wasn't just a technical analysis of what had gone wrong, but an institutional assessment of how NASA's administrative systems had failed to prevent a foreseeable tragedy. The report's recommendations were as systematic as the investigation itself. Rather than proposing ad hoc fixes or emergency measures, the board recommended comprehensive changes to NASA's procedures, organizational structure, and management philosophy. These recommendations weren't dramatic or revolutionary, but they were thorough in a way that reflected the administrative culture that had produced them. Yet, even as this investigation was proceeding with bureaucratic thoroughness, NASA's administrative machinery was beginning to implement changes based on preliminary findings. The agency couldn't afford to wait for the final report before addressing obvious problems. This created a curious administrative situation where changes were being implemented even as the investigation continued, with new procedures being developed to address problems that were still being formally documented. The investigation had revealed not just technical failures, but administrative ones, failures of communication, coordination, and institutional learning. The challenge facing NASA as 1967 progressed wasn't just fixing the technical problems that had caused the fire, but rebuilding the administrative systems that would prevent similar accidents in the future. This task would prove to be every bit as complex and time-consuming as the original development of the Apollo program itself. The months following the Apollo 204 Review Board's report represented one of the most comprehensive administrative reorganizations in NASA's brief history. What emerged wasn't the dramatic top-to-bottom restructuring that might be expected after such a catastrophic failure, but rather something more characteristically bureaucratic. A methodical, procedure-driven transformation that touched every aspect of the agency's operations while maintaining the fundamental structure that had made the Apollo program possible in the first place. The personnel changes began almost immediately, but they followed predictable administrative patterns rather than emotional responses. A position that was technically a promotion, but effectively removed him from direct operational responsibility. This wasn't a punitive action in the traditional sense, but rather an administrative recognition that new leadership was needed for the program's recovery phase. Lowe's appointment reflected NASA's administrative philosophy, rather than bringing in an outsider or making a dramatic change. The agency promoted someone from within who understood both the technical challenges and the organizational culture. Lowe had been involved in Apollo planning since its earliest days. But his new role would require him to rebuild the program's administrative framework while maintaining continuity with existing efforts. The contractor relationships also underwent systematic restructuring. This change wasn't simply a personnel decision, but part of a broader administrative effort to strengthen NASA's oversight of contractor operations and ensure that safety considerations received appropriate priority in design and manufacturing decisions. Perhaps the most significant organizational change was the establishment of new administrative structures specifically focused on safety oversight, reporting directly to the center director rather than through the program management hierarchy. This wasn't just an organizational chart modification, but a fundamental change in how safety concerns would be processed through NASA's administrative system. The creation of this independent safety office reflected a key insight from the accident investigation that safety oversight couldn't be effective if it was subordinated to the same management structure responsible for meeting schedules and controlling costs. By creating an independent reporting relationship, NASA was acknowledging that safety considerations needed their own administrative voice, separate from the operational pressures that drove day-to-day program management and external oversight. Body that would provide independent safety assessment and recommendations directly to the NASA administrator. This panel wasn't staffed by NASA employees, but by outside experts who could evaluate the agency's safety practices without being influenced by internal organizational pressures or programmatic constraints. The administrative procedures governing these new safety organizations were developed with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized all NASA operations. The Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance Office received formal charter documents that specified its authority, responsibilities, and reporting relationships. The Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel was established through formal administrative procedures that defined its membership, meeting schedule, and access to NASA information and personnel. Meanwhile, the technical changes to the Apollo spacecraft were proceeding through their own administrative channels, a decision that had been under consideration before the fire, but now became definitive policy. This decision triggered its own cascade of administrative consequences as existing contracts had to be modified, schedules adjusted, and technical specifications updated. The most visible technical change was this seemingly simple modification required extensive administrative coordination between NASA and North American Aviation, involving design reviews, testing procedures, manufacturing changes, and crew training updates. The administrative documentation for this single change filled dozens of binders and required months of coordination between multiple organizations. Material selection received similar administrative attention. These procedures weren't just technical guidelines, but formal administrative requirements that had to be incorporated into contracts, implemented in manufacturing facilities, and verified through inspection processes. The development of new spacesuits followed the same pattern of administrative thoroughness. But this technical change required comprehensive administrative support, including new specifications, testing procedures, manufacturing contracts, and crew training programs. Each of these changes, while individually significant, was implemented through the same bureaucratic machinery that had characterized the Apollo program from its beginning. Change requests were submitted through formal channels, reviewed by appropriate technical authorities, and approved through documented processes. The administrative system that had failed to prevent the Apollo 1 fire was being used to implement the changes designed to prevent similar accidents. But with enhanced oversight and more rigorous review procedures, the congressional oversight continued throughout this reorganization period, adding another layer of administrative complexity to NASA's operations. The agency had to maintain regular communication with congressional committees, providing progress reports on safety improvements and organizational changes. This oversight wasn't just political theater, but a formal administrative process that required NASA to document and justify every aspect of its reorganization efforts. The budget implications of these changes were processed through their own administrative channels. Safety improvements and organizational changes had cost implications that had to be incorporated into NASA's budget requests and justified to congressional appropriations committees. And the additional expenses associated with safety improvements and program delays required careful administrative management to maintain. Congressional and public support. By early 1968, the administrative reorganization was largely complete, at least in formal terms. The new organizational structures were in place. The new procedures had been documented and implemented, and the new personnel were settled into their roles. The administrative machinery had successfully processed one of the most comprehensive reorganizations in federal government history, transforming NASA's operations while maintaining the fundamental structure and momentum of the Apollo program. Yet, the real test of these administrative changes wouldn't come from more meetings or additional documentation, but from the practical challenge of returning Americans to space. The reorganized Apollo program would need to demonstrate that its new procedures and structures could not only prevent another tragedy like Apollo 1, but could actually support the successful completion of humanity's most ambitious undertaking. The administrative foundation had been rebuilt, but now it needed to prove that bureaucratic thoroughness could be transformed into operational success. The transition from investigation and reorganization back to active spaceflight operations revealed the curious way that bureaucratic systems rebuild confidence through the accumulation of small successes rather than dramatic gestures. Throughout 1968, NASA's newly reorganized administrative machinery faced the challenge of proving that the changes implemented after Apollo 1 had actually made the program safer and more effective. This proof would come not through inspiring speeches or bold declarations, but through the methodical completion of test flights, procedure reviews, and system verifications that demonstrated the rebuilt program's competence. The first test of the reorganized system came with Apollo 7, scheduled for October 1968. This mission represented more than just a return to crewed spaceflight. It was a comprehensive verification of every administrative and technical change that had been implemented since the fire. The spacecraft was a block to command and service module, incorporating all the safety improvements developed over the previous year. The crew training had been conducted according to new procedures that emphasized safety considerations. The launch operations would be managed through the reorganized safety oversight structure. George Lowe, now firmly established as Apollo spacecraft program office manager, presided over a preparation process that was both familiar and transformed. The basic administrative framework remained the same: detailed schedules, formal reviews, documented procedures, but it was now overlaid with additional safety oversight mechanisms that hadn't existed before. Apollo 1. Every major decision was reviewed not only by the traditional program management hierarchy, but also by the newly independent Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance Office. This dual review structure created its own administrative complexities. Decisions that might previously have been resolved in a single meeting now required coordination between multiple organizational entities, each with its own procedures and approval authorities. The result was slower decision-making, but also more thorough consideration of safety implications. The administrative cost of this enhanced oversight was significant, but it was a cost that NASA was willing to accept to rebuild confidence in the program's safety culture. The crew for Apollo 7, Wally Schirra, Don Eisel, and Walt Cunningham experienced the effects of these administrative changes directly. Their training was more comprehensive than that of previous crews, with additional emphasis on emergency procedures and safety systems operation. But more significantly, they participated in a preparation process where safety concerns were given explicit administrative priority, rather than being balanced against schedule and cost considerations. The spacecraft itself embodied the administrative transformation that had occurred since Apollo 1. But this seemingly simple change had required months of administrative coordination between NASA, North American Aviation, and numerous subcontractors. The materials used throughout the spacecraft interior had been selected according to new flammability standards, but implementing these standards had required updating thousands of technical specifications and manufacturing procedures. The launch operations at Kennedy Space Center reflected similar administrative evolution, meant that safety personnel now had independent authority to halt operations if they identified potential problems, rather than having to work through program management channels that might be influenced by schedule pressures. This change was more significant administratively than it might appear, representing a fundamental shift in how decision-making authority was distributed within the NASA hierarchy as Apollo 7 approached its October launch date. The administrative machinery was processing hundreds of readiness reviews, safety assessments, and procedural verifications. Each of these activities was conducted according to enhanced procedures that reflected lessons learned from Apollo 1. The paperwork was more extensive, the reviews more thorough, and the approval processes more stringent than they had been before. The fire. Yet this administrative thoroughness created its own challenges. The enhanced procedures meant longer preparation times and more complex coordination requirements. Some NASA officials worried that the organization might have overcorrected, creating administrative structures that were so cautious and risk-averse that they would make bold exploration impossible. The challenge was finding the right balance between safety and operational effectiveness, a balance that could only be achieved through practical experience rather than theoretical analysis. The successful completion of Apollo 7 in October 1968 represented more than just a technical achievement. It was an administrative validation of the entire reorganization effort. The mission proved that NASA's new safety procedures and organizational structures could support successful operations, not just prevent accidents. The enhanced oversight mechanisms hadn't prevented the crew from accomplishing their mission objectives, and the new safety-focused culture hadn't paralyzed decision-making or operational effectiveness. This success created momentum for increasingly ambitious missions, requiring the crew to travel to the moon and back without the lunar module that would eventually be needed for landing missions. The administrative machinery that had successfully supported Apollo 7 would now need to handle the additional complexity of lunar operations. The preparation for Apollo 8 revealed how the administrative changes had been integrated into NASA's operational culture. The enhanced safety oversight didn't just apply to spacecraft design and manufacturing, but extended to mission planning, crew training, and operational procedures. Every aspect of the mission was subjected to the kind of comprehensive safety analysis that might have prevented the Apollo 1 accident if it had been in place 2 years earlier. The Saturn V rocket underwent more extensive testing than previous vehicles, and the command and service module received additional inspections and system verifications. Meanwhile, following the same enhanced procedures and organizational structures that had been developed over the previous year. The administrative machinery had learned to incorporate safety considerations into every aspect of its operations, from long-term planning to daily operational decisions. As 1968 progressed toward its close, NASA's administrative transformation was proving its effectiveness through operational success rather than theoretical analysis. The reorganized agency was demonstrating that bureaucratic thoroughness could coexist with operational boldness, that enhanced safety procedures could support rather than hinder ambitious exploration objectives. The administrative foundation, built after Apollo 1, was proving capable of supporting increasingly complex and ambitious missions. The question that remained as Apollo 8 approached its December launch was whether this administrative success could be sustained as the program moved toward its ultimate objective, landing humans on the moon and returning them safely to Earth. The reorganized NASA had proven it could conduct Earth orbital missions safely and effectively. But the lunar landing would require operational capabilities and administrative coordination that had never been attempted before. The administrative machinery rebuilt after Apollo 1 would face its ultimate test not in Earth's orbit, but in the vast emptiness between worlds. Asterisk by late 1968. NASA's administrative machinery had evolved into something resembling a vast, methodical organism dedicated to the systematic verification of every component, procedure, and operation that would eventually be required for a lunar landing mission. The Apollo program had become less a single project than an ecosystem of parallel activities, each proceeding according to its own detailed timeline, while maintaining precise coordination with dozens of other concurrent efforts. The daily rhythm of this enterprise was not the dramatic countdown sequence popularized by television coverage, but rather the quiet, persistent accumulation of test results, procedure verifications, and administrative approvals that would ultimately make those dramatic moments possible. The preparation for Apollo 8 illustrated the methodical nature of this systematic approach. A comprehensive systems verification that involves not only the prime crew of Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders, but also the backup crew of Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Fred Hayes. This wasn't redundancy for its own sake, but rather a recognition that crew proficiency was itself a system that required testing and verification just like any mechanical component. The administrative coordination required for these tests was staggering in its complexity. Each test involved dozens of support personnel, multiple facilities, and coordination with contractors and subcontractors across the country. The scheduling alone required dedicated administrative staff who did nothing but coordinate the availability of personnel, facilities, and equipment. When the flight readiness test revealed minor discrepancies, such tests inevitably did these had to be documented, analyzed, and resolved through formal change procedures before the mission could proceed. The Command Module Simulator at Kennedy Space Center operated according to schedules that were planned months in advance, with specific training objectives assigned to each session. The crews weren't simply practicing their mission procedures, but completing formal training requirements that were documented and verified according to NASA's quality assurance protocols. This systematic approach extended to every aspect of mission preparation. When NASA determined that Apollo 8 would be humanity's first journey to another celestial body, this wasn't a spontaneous decision, but the culmination of months of administrative analysis and planning. The mission objectives had been defined through formal requirements, documents, approved through NASA's program management hierarchy, and verified through technical analysis and risk assessment procedures. Meanwhile, the preparation for subsequent missions was proceeding according to its own methodical timeline. Each delivery triggered its own cascade of administrative activities: acceptance, inspections, documentation, reviews, systems integration procedures, and quality verifications. The physical process of assembling these spacecraft was itself an exercise in bureaucratic thoroughness. Every connection was verified, every system was tested, and every step was documented according to quality control protocols that ensured nothing would be left to chance. The crew training for Apollo 9: James McDivitt, Russell Schweikart, and David Scott, along with their backups Charles Pete Conrad, Alan Bean, and Richard Gordon, followed the same systematic approach that was being applied to all Apollo crews, verifying not only their ability to operate in the spacecraft environment, but also the compatibility between crew, spacecraft, and support systems. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of this systematic approach was the attention paid to seemingly routine activities that supported the main mission objectives. This training wasn't a dramatic simulation of space exploration, but a methodical verification of recovery procedures, complete with detailed coordination between the crew, recovery personnel, and the support vessel MV Retriever. This training represented the kind of systematic thoroughness that characterized every aspect of Apollo operations. NASA couldn't simply assume that procedures that worked in theory would work in practice. Everything had to be tested, verified, and documented. The administrative burden of coordinating these tests was enormous, involving multiple organizations, detailed scheduling, and formal documentation of results and lessons learned. The hardware preparation for Apollo 10, still months away from its scheduled launch, was already following the same methodical patterns. While the first stage of the Saturn V had arrived at the vehicle assembly, building and stacking operations had begun. This parallel processing of multiple missions represented one of Apollo's most significant administrative achievements. The program had developed the capacity to support multiple complex missions simultaneously, each at different stages of preparation, but all coordinated through the same systematic procedures and organizational structures. The administrative complexity of maintaining this parallel processing was unprecedented in government operations, requiring coordination between dozens of organizations and thousands of individuals. The systematic nature of Apollo operations extended even to crew assignments. Wasn't a casual personnel decision, but part of a comprehensive crew rotation system that ensured appropriate experience levels and training. Progression for each mission. Each crew assignment triggered its own administrative cascade. Training. Schedules had to be developed, facility access arranged, technical briefings scheduled, and medical monitoring initiated. The crew rotation system represented a form of institutional memory, ensuring that lessons learned from each mission would be incorporated into the preparation for subsequent missions through the experience of crews who had participated in earlier flights as 1968 progressed toward its close. This systematic approach was demonstrating its effectiveness through the successful completion of Apollo 7 and the approaching readiness of Apollo 8. The administrative machinery wasn't just processing individual missions, but managing the systematic progression toward increasingly complex objectives. Each mission built upon the capabilities verified in previous flights, while simultaneously validating procedures and systems that would be required for future missions. The methodical nature of this progression was perhaps most evident in the way that seemingly routine activities were coordinated with mission-critical objectives. Ground testing, crew training, hardware assembly, systems integration each proceeded according to its own detailed timeline while maintaining precise coordination with all other activities. The result was an operational tempo that appeared almost mundane in its regularity, but was actually unprecedented in its complexity and ambition. Yet this systematic approach contained its own challenges. The very methodical nature of Apollo operations created enormous coordination requirements and administrative overhead. Every change, no matter how minor, had to be analyzed for its impact on other systems and procedures. Every test result had to be documented and distributed to appropriate organizations. Every procedural modification had to be approved through formal change control processes that could take weeks to complete. As Apollo 8 approached its December launch, the question facing NASA's administrative machinery wasn't whether the systematic approach would work. It had already proven effective for Earth's orbital missions, but whether it could be scaled to support the additional complexity of lunar operations. The methodical procedures that had successfully supported Apollo 7 would now need to coordinate activities across 140,000 miles of space, with communication delays and operational constraints that had never been encountered before. The months spanning late 1968 and early 1969 represented a curious period in the Apollo program's development, when the systematic methodologies that had been refined over years of preparation were finally being applied to operations of unprecedented complexity and risk. The administrative machinery had to evolve from managing Earth orbital missions to coordinating activities that would span the vast distance between the Earth and Moon, requiring new procedures, enhanced coordination mechanisms, and administrative structures that could function reliably across interplanetary distances. The success of Apollo 8 in December 1968 had validated NASA's systematic approach to lunar operations. But it had also revealed the additional administrative complexity involved in managing missions beyond Earth orbit. The 3-day journey to the Moon and back had required continuous coordination between Mission Control in Houston, tracking stations around the world, and the crew themselves, all while maintaining the methodical procedures that ensured mission safety and success. The mission control operations for Apollo 8 illustrated the administrative evolution that had occurred since the early Apollo missions. Each controller was responsible for specific systems and had clearly defined authority to recommend mission modifications or abort procedures if problems were detected. This systematic approach to mission control represented a form of distributed decision-making that was unprecedented in human exploration. Rather than relying on individual judgment or heroic leadership, Apollo missions were managed through collaborative processes that ensured appropriate expertise was applied to every decision, creating a form of institutional knowledge that could function reliably even under extreme stress. The preparation for Apollo 9, scheduled for March 1969, required administrative coordination that was even more complex than previous missions. This flight would test the lunar module in Earth orbit, requiring coordination between 2 separate spacecraft and validation of procedures that would eventually be used for lunar landings. The mission planning alone involved dozens of organizations and required months of coordination to ensure that all systems, procedures, and personnel were properly integrated. McDivitt, Schweikart, and Scott had to master not only command module operations, but also lunar module systems, rendezvous procedures, and the complex coordination required for multi-spacecraft operations. Their backup crew received identical training, ensuring that mission-critical knowledge wasn't dependent on the availability of specific individuals. The administrative burden of supporting this training was enormous. The lunar module simulator had to be maintained and operated according to the same rigorous procedures applied to flight hardware. Training schedules had to be coordinated with hardware availability, facility access, and the availability of instructors and support personnel. Each training session was documented and evaluated, with results fed back into the overall crew readiness assessment process. Meanwhile, the hardware preparation continued according to the methodical timelines that had been established months earlier. The integration of Command Service Module and Lunar Module required extensive testing and verification to ensure that the 2 spacecraft could operate together reliably. This wasn't simply a matter of connecting cables and running systems checks, but involved comprehensive testing of communication systems, navigation equipment, life support coordination, and emergency procedures. The systematic nature of this preparation was evident in the attention paid to seemingly routine details. This transportation required detailed planning, specialized equipment, and coordination between multiple organizations. Nothing was left to chance or individual initiative. Every step followed documented procedures that had been developed and approved through NASA's configuration management system. The launch operations themselves had evolved to accommodate the additional complexity of multi-spacecraft missions. Launch Complex 39, which had been designed specifically for Apollo operations, now supported procedures that were far more complex than anything attempted during the early missions. The countdown procedures alone filled hundreds of pages with detailed checklists specifying exactly what needed to be verified at each stage of the process. But perhaps the most significant administrative evolution was in the area of contingency planning. NASA had developed detailed procedures for handling various types of emergencies and system failures. But lunar missions introduced new categories of potential problems that required entirely new administrative approaches. If something went wrong during a lunar mission, the crew might be beyond immediate assistance, requiring them to implement recovery procedures independently while maintaining communication with ground controllers across interplanetary distances. This reality had led to the development of what NASA called mission rules, formal procedures that specified exactly how various situations should be handled during flight operations. These rules weren't suggestions or guidelines, but binding policies that governed flight controller decision-making. The development and approval of mission rules had become a significant administrative process in its own right, involving detailed technical analysis, extensive coordination between organizations, and formal approval through NASA's management hierarchy. The successful completion of Apollo 9 in March 1969 represented another validation of NASA's systematic approach to complex operations. The mission had successfully tested lunar module operations in Earth orbit, validated rendezvous and docking procedures, and demonstrated the crew's ability to operate two spacecraft simultaneously. But more significantly, from an administrative perspective, it had proven that NASA's methodical procedures could support the kind of complex, multi-vehicle operations that would be required for lunar landing missions. This mission would take a complete Apollo spacecraft command service module and lunar module to the Moon, testing all systems and procedures except the actual landing and takeoff from the lunar surface. The administrative complexity of Apollo 10 was unprecedented, requiring coordination of activities that would span nearly 250,000 miles and involve precise timing of operations that had never been attempted before. The Christopher Cernan and Young would need to execute procedures that had been developed through systematic analysis and ground testing, but had never been validated in the actual lunar environment. Yet the systematic approach that NASA had developed over the previous years provided confidence that even this unprecedented mission could be managed successfully. The methodical procedures, detailed training, comprehensive testing, and systematic documentation that characterized Apollo operations had created an institutional capability that could handle complexity and uncertainty through systematic preparation, rather than individual heroics. As Apollo 10 approached its May launch date, the administrative machinery that supported Apollo operations was functioning at unprecedented levels of complexity and effectiveness. The systematic methodologies that had been developed and refined over years of Earth orbital missions were now being applied to crew operations that would span interplanetary distances and require coordination between Earth-based controllers and crew members operating in the lunar environment. The question that remained as Apollo 10 prepared for launch wasn't whether NASA's systematic approach could handle the technical complexity of lunar operations. Previous missions had already demonstrated that capability, but whether it could maintain the same level of methodical precision when applied to humanity's first attempt to land on another world. Apollo 10, launched in May 1969, represented the culmination of NASA's systematic approach to preparing for lunar landing operations. Every procedure that would be required for Apollo 11 would be tested and verified during this mission, with one critical exception: the actual landing and takeoff from the lunar surface. The administrative complexity of coordinating this dress rehearsal revealed both the sophistication of NASA's operational procedures and the enormous institutional confidence that had been built through years of methodical preparation. The mission itself embodied the systematic philosophy that had come to characterize Apollo operations. Thomas Stafford, Eugene Cernan, and John Young would execute procedures that had been developed through extensive ground testing, crew training, and mission simulation, but they would be doing so in the actual lunar environment where no human beings had ever operated before. The administrative framework that supported their mission had to account for the reality that they would be conducting operations 240,000 miles from Earth, where immediate assistance was impossible and communication delays could affect real-time decision-making. The mission control operations for Apollo 10 represented an evolution of the systematic procedures that had been developed for previous missions, but with additional complexity due to the lunar operational environment. But they were now coordinating activities across interplanetary distances with communication delays that could affect time-critical operations. The mission rules that governed Apollo 10 operations had been developed through months of systematic analysis and review. These rules specified exactly how various situations should be handled. From routine operational procedures to emergency responses, the development of these rules had required extensive coordination between flight controllers, crew members, spacecraft designers, and mission planners, all working together to anticipate and prepare for situations that had never been encountered before. Perhaps the most significant administrative challenge was managing the coordination between two separate spacecraft operating in the lunar environment. When Stafford and Cernan descended toward the lunar surface in the lunar module, while Young remained in lunar orbit aboard the command module, Mission Control had to maintain communication and coordination with both vehicles simultaneously, while accounting for the communication delays and operational constraints imposed by lunar operations. This coordination required administrative procedures that were unprecedented in complexity and scope. Flight controllers had to monitor the status of both spacecraft, coordinate activities between the two crews, and maintain awareness of how operations in one vehicle might affect the other. The systematic procedures that had been developed for single spacecraft operations had to be extended and modified to account for multi-vehicle coordination in the lunar environment. The crew training for Apollo 10 had been the most comprehensive yet attempted, reflecting the complexity of the operations they would be conducting. Stafford, Cernan, and Young had spent months mastering not only the technical procedures required for lunar operations, but also the coordination and communication protocols that would ensure mission success. Their training wasn't simply about individual proficiency, but about team effectiveness under unprecedented operational conditions. The systematic approach to crew preparation was evident in the attention paid to contingency procedures and emergency operations. The crew had practiced responses to various types of system failures and operational problems, but they had also trained extensively in the kind of real-time problem-solving and adaptation that might be required when operating in an environment where ground support was limited by communication delays and distance. Meanwhile, the ground support organization had evolved to support the additional complexity of lunar operations. The tracking and communication networks that supported Apollo missions now spanned the globe, with stations positioned to maintain continuous communication with spacecraft throughout their journey to and from the Moon. The coordination of these networks required administrative procedures that ensured seamless handoffs between stations while maintaining continuous monitoring of spacecraft systems and crew activities. The successful execution of Apollo 10 in May 1969 represented more than just a technical achievement. It was a validation of the entire systematic approach that NASA had developed over the preceding years. The mission proved that the administrative procedures, training methodologies, and coordination mechanisms developed for Earth orbital operations could be successfully extended to lunar operations of unprecedented complexity. But the mission also revealed the extraordinary institutional confidence that had been built through years of methodical preparation. When Stafford and Cernan descended to within 50,000 feet of the lunar surface in the lunar module, they were executing procedures that had been developed, tested, and verified through systematic, ground-based preparation. But they were doing so with a confidence that comes from institutional competence rather than individual heroism. The post-flight analysis of Apollo 10 followed the same systematic procedures that had been applied to all previous missions. Every aspect of the mission was documented, analyzed, and evaluated for lessons that could be applied to future operations. The crew debriefings, system performance analyses, and operational assessments generated hundreds of pages of documentation that would be incorporated into the preparation for Apollo 11. This systematic approach to institutional learning was one of NASA's most significant achievements. The agency had developed procedures for capturing, analyzing, and applying operational experience in ways that improved performance and reduced risk with each successive mission. The knowledge gained from Apollo 10 would be systematically incorporated into Apollo 11 preparations, ensuring that the lunar landing mission would benefit from every lesson learned during the dress rehearsal as Apollo 10 concluded successfully. In late May 1969, the administrative machinery that supported Apollo operations was functioning at unprecedented levels of sophistication and effectiveness. The systematic methodologies that had been developed over years of preparation had been proven capable of supporting operations of extraordinary complexity and risk. The institutional confidence that had been built through methodical preparation and systematic validation was now ready to support humanity's first attempt to land on another world. The question that remained as Apollo 11 preparation began wasn't whether NASA's administrative systems could handle the complexity of lunar landing. Operations Apollo 10 had already demonstrated that capability. But whether the systematic approach that had proven so effective for preparation and testing could maintain the same level of precision and effectiveness when applied to operations that would make history. In just 2 months, the methodical procedures and institutional competence that had been built through years of systematic preparation would face their ultimate test, not just reaching the moon, but landing on it and returning safely to Earth. On the morning of July 16, 1969, as Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins prepared for what would become humanity's most famous journey, the real story of Apollo 11 was unfolding, not in the dramatic moments that would capture headlines, but in the methodical execution of thousands of routine procedures that had been developed, tested, and refined over the preceding 8 years. The lunar landing would ultimately succeed not because of individual heroism or technological brilliance, though both were present, but because of the most comprehensive administrative and operational system ever created for a single human endeavor. The morning routine at Kennedy Space Center began hours before the 9:32 a.m. EDT launch time, following procedures that had been documented in excruciating detail and practiced countless times. The crew wake-up call came at 4:15 a.m., initiating a sequence of activities that were choreographed with the precision of a ballet but the mundane practicality of a factory shift change. Medical examinations, breakfast, suit-up procedures, transport. To the launch pad, each step followed protocols that had been developed through years of systematic refinement and operational experience. The administrative coordination required to execute these seemingly routine activities was staggering in its complexity. The crew's breakfast wasn't simply a meal, but a carefully planned, nutritional and scheduling activity that had to be coordinated with medical monitoring, suit-up timing, and launch pad access procedures. The menu had been approved through NASA's nutritional requirements process, the timing coordinated with the overall launch schedule, and the preparation supervised by personnel who understood that even this mundane activity was a critical component of mission success. The suit-up procedures followed the same methodical approach that characterized all Apollo operations. Each component of the crew's spacesuits had been individually tested, inspected, and verified according to quality assurance procedures that ensured nothing would be left to chance. The process of helping the crew into their suits wasn't simply a matter of assistance but a formal procedure conducted by qualified technicians following documented protocols that specified exactly how each component should be installed, verified, and tested, but with additional attention to the unique requirements of a lunar landing mission. The Command Module Columbia and Lunar Module Eagle had been integrated, tested, and verified according to procedures that had been refined through the operational experience gained from Apollo 8, 9, and 10. Every system had been checked and double-checked, according to quality control protocols that left nothing to individual judgment or assumption. The launch countdown itself represented the culmination of administrative and technical procedures that had been in development since the beginning of the Apollo program. The countdown wasn't simply a sequence of technical preparations, but a formal administrative process that coordinated the activities of thousands of people across multiple organizations and facilities. Each major milestone in the countdown required formal verification and approval before the sequence could continue, beginning a journey that would capture the world's attention but would be conducted according to the same methodical procedures that had characterized all previous Apollo missions. The launch itself, while dramatic in appearance, was actually the routine execution of procedures that had been tested and verified through multiple previous missions. The mission control operations that supported deployed. Apollo 11 represented the mature evolution of systematic procedures that had been developed over years of operational experience, following detailed procedures that specified exactly how various situations should be handled. The flight control team wasn't improvising or responding to situations through individual initiative, but executing systematic procedures that had been developed through extensive analysis and testing. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Apollo 11's launch phase was how routine it had become from an operational perspective. The same procedures that had once seemed impossibly complex and risky had been refined through operational experience, to the point where they were executed with the mundane precision of a well-established manufacturing process. The crew, mission control, and ground support organizations all functioned according to systematic procedures that had proven their effectiveness through previous missions. This operational maturity was evident in the crew's daily routine during the 3-day journey to the moon. Their activities followed detailed timelines that had been developed through systematic analysis of mission requirements, crew workload, and operational efficiency. But these communications were largely routine status reports and procedural coordination rather than dramatic exchanges. Even the crew's personal activities followed systematic procedures that had been developed through operational experience. The fact that Neil Armstrong had brought theremin music for the journey wasn't a spontaneous personal choice, but reflected systematic planning that recognized the importance of crew morale and psychological well-being for mission success. The administrative coordination required to maintain mission control operations throughout the 3-day journey was unprecedented in complexity, but had become routine through operational experience, with formal handoff procedures that maintained continuity of awareness and decision-making authority across shift changes. The tracking and communication networks that supported the mission operated according to systematic procedures that coordinated ground stations around the world to maintain continuous contact with the spacecraft. This coordination required precise scheduling and coordination between organizations in multiple countries. But it had become a routine aspect of Apollo operations through the systematic development of international cooperation agreements and operational procedures. As Apollo 11 approached the moon on July 19th, the operational procedures shifted to focus on the unique requirements of lunar operations. The crew and mission control began executing procedures that had been tested during Apollo 10 but would now be applied to an actual landing mission. The systematic preparation that had characterized the entire Apollo program was now being applied to humanity's first attempt to land on another world. The transition from Earth, orbital to lunar operations required no fundamental changes in operational philosophy or procedures. The same systematic approach that had proven effective for Earth orbital missions was simply extended to lunar operations, with additional procedures and coordination mechanisms to account for the unique requirements of lunar landing operations. The administrative machinery that supported Apollo operations had proven adaptable enough to handle unprecedented complexity while maintaining the methodical precision that ensured mission success. Yet, as the moment of lunar landing approached, the true test of NASA's systematic approach wasn't whether the procedures would work. They had already been proven through extensive testing and operational experience, but whether the institutional confidence built through years of methodical preparation would hold when applied to an operation that no human beings had ever attempted before. The administrative machinery was functioning perfectly. But it was about to support an endeavor that would test not only technical capabilities, but the fundamental effectiveness of systematic preparation applied to unprecedented human achievement. Beginning, humanity's first attempt to land on another celestial body. From an operational perspective, this separation was simply the execution of procedures that had been tested during Apollo 10. But the psychological and administrative weight of the moment was unprecedented. Every aspect of the landing sequence would be conducted according to systematic procedures that had been developed through years of analysis and testing. But those procedures were now being applied to an operation that would either make history or become a catastrophic failure. That might end the Apollo program entirely. The mission control operations during the landing sequence revealed the mature sophistication of NASA's systematic approach to complex operations. The famous 1202 computer alarms that occurred during the descent weren't handled through individual heroism or brilliant improvisation, but through systematic procedures that had been developed specifically to handle computer overload conditions. Steve Bales, the guidance officer monitoring the computer systems, had participated in training sessions that had specifically addressed computer alarm situations. His decision to recommend continuing the landing wasn't based on personal judgment or intuitive risk assessment, but on systematic analysis of the alarm conditions according to procedures that had been developed through extensive testing and simulation. The mission control response to the computer alarms demonstrated the effectiveness of systematic preparation applied to unprecedented operational conditions. The landing sequence itself followed procedures that had been developed through extensive simulation and analysis, but adapted in real time to account for the actual lunar terrain that Armstrong and Aldrin encountered. Following a trajectory that had been calculated through systematic analysis of lunar orbital mechanics, spacecraft performance, and landing site requirements. Yet the final moments of the landing revealed both the strengths and limitations of systematic preparation. Armstrong's decision to manually pilot the lunar module over the boulder field wasn't a deviation from procedures, but an application of the systematic training that had prepared him to make such decisions when automated systems proved insufficient. The crew training had emphasized that the commanders needed to be prepared to take manual control when conditions required it, and Armstrong's actions during the landing represented the systematic application of that training to actual operational conditions. From Mission Control's perspective, this wasn't just a dramatic moment, but the successful completion of systematic procedures that had been in development for over 8 years. The landing had been accomplished not through luck or individual brilliance, but through the methodical execution of procedures that had been developed, tested, and refined through operational experience. The immediate post-landing activities followed the same systematic approach that characterized all Apollo operations. The crew conducted systematic checks of lunar module systems, verified that the spacecraft was stable and properly configured for surface operations, and established communications with Mission Control according to procedures that had been developed specifically for post-landing operations. Even in the immediate aftermath of humanity's first lunar landing, the crew and ground controllers followed systematic procedures rather than allowing excitement or emotion to affect operational decision-making. The preparation for the lunar surface operations that would follow demonstrated the extraordinary attention to detail that characterized Apollo procedures. Every aspect of their surface activities had been planned, practiced, and verified according to procedures that ensured mission objectives would be accomplished while maintaining crew safety and operational effectiveness. The administrative coordination required to support lunar surface operations was unprecedented in complexity. Mission Control had to maintain communication with the crew on the lunar surface while simultaneously monitoring Columbia in lunar orbit, coordinating with tracking stations around the world, and managing the real-time analysis of data being transmitted from the lunar surface. This coordination required systematic procedures that had been developed specifically for multi-vehicle operations in the lunar environment. Meanwhile, Michael Collins, orbiting alone in the command module Columbia, was executing procedures that were equally systematic but received far less public attention. His role in maintaining the command module systems and preparing for the eventual rendezvous with the lunar module was critical to mission success. But it required the same methodical execution of procedures that had characterized all Apollo operations. The period between landing and the first EVA provided a brief interlude that revealed the human side of the systematic procedures that governed Apollo operations. But the crew requested permission to begin surface operations earlier than planned. This request was processed through Mission Control's systematic decision-making procedures, with flight controllers analyzing the implications for crew rest, surface operations, timing, and subsequent mission activities. The approval to begin surface operations early wasn't simply a matter of accommodating crew preferences, but required systematic analysis of how the schedule change would affect all subsequent mission activities. Mission Control's decision-making process demonstrated the flexibility that could be built into systematic procedures without compromising the methodical approach that ensured mission success. As the time for the first lunar EVA approached, administrative machinery that supported Apollo operations was functioning at unprecedented levels of complexity and effectiveness. The systematic procedures that had been developed over years of preparation were now being applied to operations that would be witnessed by hundreds of millions of people around the world. But the operational approach remained the same: methodical execution of procedures that had characterized all Apollo activities. The crew's activities during EVA preparation weren't spontaneous or dramatic, but were the systematic execution of procedures that had been developed through extensive training and testing. The question that remained as Armstrong prepared to open the lunar module hatch wasn't whether the systematic procedures would work. They had already proven their effectiveness throughout the mission, but whether the methodical approach that had brought humanity to the Moon could maintain its precision and effectiveness during the historic moments that would follow. The administrative machinery was functioning perfectly, but it was about to support operations that would transform human understanding of what was possible through systematic preparation and methodical execution. The moment that would define human achievement for generations was, from an operational perspective, simply the execution of procedures that had been developed through systematic analysis of crew capabilities, equipment requirements, and mission objectives. Armstrong's famous words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," were delivered not in a moment of spontaneous inspiration, but according to communication procedures that had been planned and rehearsed as part of the systematic preparation for lunar surface operations. The lunar surface activities that followed demonstrated the mature sophistication of NASA's systematic approach to unprecedented operations, conducting activities that followed detailed timelines developed through extensive analysis of scientific objectives, operational constraints, and crew workload considerations. Their surface operations weren't improvisational explorations, but the methodical execution of procedures that had been developed to maximize the scientific and symbolic value of humanity's first lunar landing. The crew's activities on the lunar surface followed systematic procedures that had been developed through extensive training and analysis. Even the symbolic activities, such as planting the American flag, followed procedures that had been developed to ensure these activities could be accomplished efficiently without compromising scientific objectives or crew safety. The Mission Control operations that supported the lunar surface EVA revealed the extraordinary coordination capabilities that had been developed through years of systematic preparation. Flight controllers monitored crew activities, spacecraft systems, and life support performance while maintaining communication with tracking stations around the world and coordinating real-time analysis of the scientific data being transmitted from the lunar surface. This coordination required systematic procedures that ensured appropriate expertise was applied to every aspect of the surface operations while maintaining overall mission coordination and safety oversight. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the lunar surface operations was how routine they had become from a procedural perspective. The systematic approach that had been developed for Apollo operations had proven adaptable, enough to support activities that no human beings had ever conducted before. The crew and mission control functioned according to the same methodical procedures that had characterized all previous Apollo missions, demonstrating that systematic preparation could enable unprecedented human achievement without requiring fundamental changes in operational approach. The transition from surface operations to preparation for lunar departure followed the same systematic procedures that characterized all Apollo activities. This preparation wasn't simply a matter of starting engines and lifting off, but involved systematic verification of all systems and coordination with mission control to ensure optimal timing for the rendezvous with Michael Collins in the command module, following procedures that had been tested during Apollo 10, but were now being applied to an actual departure from the lunar surface. The ascent phase represented one of the most critical aspects of the entire mission, since any failure of the lunar module's ascent stage would leave Armstrong and Aldrin stranded on the lunar surface with no possibility of rescue. The systematic preparation for the ascent phase had included extensive analysis of abort procedures and contingency operations. But the crew and mission control approached the ascent with the confidence that comes from thorough preparation and systematic verification of all procedures and systems. The ascent proceeded according to plan, demonstrating once again the effectiveness of NASA's methodical approach to complex operations, reuniting the crew after their historic lunar surface operations. This rendezvous followed the same systematic procedures that had been developed and tested during previous Apollo missions, but it represented the culmination of humanity's first lunar landing mission. The successful completion of the rendezvous demonstrated that the systematic approach developed for Apollo operations could handle even the most complex and unprecedented operational requirements. This disposal of the lunar module wasn't simply a matter of getting rid of unnecessary equipment, but followed systematic procedures that ensured the jettisoned spacecraft wouldn't interfere with subsequent operations or create hazards for future lunar missions. Initiating the 3-day journey back to Earth, the trans-Earth injection maneuver followed the same systematic procedures that had been used for the translunar injection at the beginning of the mission, demonstrating the consistency and reliability of the operational procedures that supported Apollo missions. The return journey to Earth followed the same methodical routine that had characterized the outbound journey. The crew maintained regular communication with mission control, conducted scheduled activities according to detailed timelines, and prepared for the final phase of the mission according to systematic procedures that had been developed and refined. Through operational experience, return journey wasn't simply a matter of coasting back to Earth, but required continuous monitoring and coordination to ensure the spacecraft remained on the proper trajectory and all systems functioned properly. The recovery operations followed systematic procedures that had been developed and tested through previous missions, ensuring that the crew would be retrieved quickly and safely while preserving the lunar samples and mission data they had brought back from the Moon. But perhaps the most telling aspect of Apollo 11's conclusion was the systematic approach to post-flight operations, designed to prevent any theoretical lunar pathogens from contaminating Earth's biosphere. This quarantine wasn't simply a precautionary measure, but followed detailed procedures that had been developed through systematic analysis of biological risks and contamination prevention requirements. The post-flight debriefings, data analysis, and mission assessment activities followed the same systematic procedures that had been applied to all previous Apollo missions. Every aspect of Apollo 11 was documented, analyzed, and evaluated for lessons that could be applied to future missions. The systematic approach to institutional learning that had characterized the Apollo program from its beginning continued even after the successful completion of humanity's first lunar landing. As the Apollo 11 crew emerged from quarantine in August, the administrative machinery that had supported their historic mission was already shifting focus to subsequent lunar landing missions. Apollo 12, scheduled for November 1969, would follow the same systematic procedures and operational approaches that had proven successful for Apollo 11, but with refinements and improvements based on the lessons learned from the first lunar landing mission. The success of Apollo 11 had validated the systematic approach that NASA had developed over the preceding 8 years, demonstrating that methodical preparation and systematic execution could enable unprecedented human achievement. The lunar landing hadn't been accomplished through individual heroism or brilliant improvisation, but through the most comprehensive application of systematic procedures and institutional competence that had ever been attempted for a single human endeavor. Yet, even as the world celebrated humanity's first lunar landing, NASA's administrative machinery was already processing the lessons learned from Apollo 11 and incorporating them into the preparation for subsequent missions. The systematic approach that had made the lunar landing possible would continue to support additional lunar missions, each building upon the experience gained from previous flights while maintaining the methodical precision that had proven so effective for complex space operations. The true legacy of Apollo 11 wasn't just that human beings had walked on the moon, but that systematic preparation and methodical execution had proven capable of enabling achievements that had once seemed impossible. The administrative and operational procedures developed for Apollo would influence space exploration, engineering projects, and complex operations management for decades to come, demonstrating that the most extraordinary human achievements often result from the most methodical and systematic approaches to preparation and execution. As you drift off to sleep, consider how the greatest adventure in human history unfolded not through dramatic moments of inspiration, but through the patient accumulation of meetings, procedures, documentation, and systematic preparation. In the end, reaching the moon required not just rockets and courage, but the most comprehensive bureaucratic undertaking ever attempted. A reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary achievements emerge from the most methodical and mundane foundations.